I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. Appreciate everybody being here. I know we've got a few still going to class, but for those of you who are staying here, thanks for participating and being part of our class this morning again. Oh, there he is. I knew something. Decaf was all that was left. So.
Decaf's the only thing I like to drink.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't want to get that much of a buzz.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, well, let's get the channel changer up here. All right, it's good to see everybody. Thanks for being here. Am I on? No, now I am. All right, Ken, there I am. Okay, I didn't think. I'm loud enough that sometimes I think I'm on when I'm not. But we are in Genesis, a fresh approach, moving into Genesis 2. And when I invited Lee to come and teach with me, I told Lee, I said, let me rephrase that, I apologize. I'm going to try and ask a different set of questions. And so we've been reading some of the same literature and thinking through some of the issues that we've studied. Again, because I personally think that we've asked the wrong questions when coming to the book of Genesis. We're asking 21st century American Christian questions, scientific questions in many instances, when the book's written to 12th, 13th century Israelite slaves coming up out of Egypt who absolutely have no clue who their God is. And so I think that when you ask the right questions, you get a different set of answers. And there is a viewpoint to Genesis, and I think it's called Concordia. Is that a word you're familiar with?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And it's a belief that while God answered the questions of the Israelites, He went ahead and answered advanced civilization's questions scientifically. And so that what you have in Genesis is on the surface answers to the Israelite questions, but then underneath the surface, answer to modern science questions. I don't go along with that view. I don't think God was trying to address 21st century scientific questions. And I think if you ask those questions, you're going to be disappointed with your answers because you're going to end up going, okay, something here doesn't work. I don't know if y'all remember, but one of the things I said early on in this series was I don't believe that the Bible and science contradict each other. I don't believe that. However, I do believe that when you come to a disagreement, you need to be willing to ask yourself, are we looking or asking the right questions? And I'm convinced that oftentimes we're asking the wrong questions, which is why science and Christianity sometimes appears to conflict. So if you think for a moment less, boy, you are messed up. I am. I tell everybody, when people say to me, what part of the Bible gives you the greatest amount of confusion? It's Genesis 1 through 11. I'm just here to tell you. I can understand Revelation better than I can that. So a little reflection on that, Lee, where you are personally. You may be very different from me.
Yeah.
Which,
No, I mean, I think a lot of it is a similar way of thinking. Certainly not the way I grew up, and you're probably the same. I was sometimes trying to ask these questions that, and we really just never stopped to think about why would God be trying to answer this question to the Israelites
who weren't asking that question,
and who have had no idea even what's that again? It's not until we have progressed with, and I'll use that term loosely, carefully at times with science, but as far as understanding things, God couldn't have answered those questions for the Israelites because they wouldn't have known what He was talking about, And so, but I think as growing up, it was one of those things, we would ask that because that was it was who we were rather than putting ourselves back in the situation, just as putting ourselves back in first century, when there's questions arise there or certain, we don't think a whole lot about, why were they having issues with idolatry? Well, you have to put yourself back into that situation to understand why, because basically everybody but the Jews were involved in idolatry.
Big time.
And of course, they had issues. They struggled with it for years and years.
Example, real quick, and we've already mentioned this. If you're an Israelite slave coming out of Egypt, and someone mentions to you or shows you the sun, you're thinking in terms of Ra, the chief god of the Egyptians. I mean, you've been taught all your life. That thing that comes up in the morning and goes across the sky is Ra. It's everywhere in Egypt. I mean, it's on their temples. It was out in the public. The priesthood was the priesthood of Ra. And so you've heard all your life, this is our God, this is who protects us. And then comes the Israelite God, and guess what he does in one of the plagues? He blackens out Ra. Ra disappears. And you're going, whoa, what kind of God can cause Ra to not appear in the morning and go through the day? And so the battles are these battles over gods. Again, I tell people all the time, and we probably won't get to the plagues in this series because it's Genesis, because they're over in Exodus. But I tell people, when you look at the plagues, don't think, here's what happened scientifically. Think, here's how God attacked the theology, the gods of the Egyptians. I mean, turning the Nile to blood. The Nile was a god to the Egyptians. It was their, pardon the phrase, lifeblood, okay? Who Moses comes along and turns into real blood as an assault on their gods. And so if you don't read Exodus as being anti-pagan, anti-idolatry, you're missing a lot of the images.
Yeah, because as you say, you look at each plague had a purpose.
It did.
And that's, again, that's not something that we thought about a great deal. At least I didn't think about it a great deal until much later in my studies that I start to recognize. I remember finally in graduate school beginning to think in those terms. Yeah, you remember the final plague, the death of the firstborn? Whose firstborn was the biggest one to die? It was Pharaoh's. Pharaoh's a god. He's a god in Egyptian pantheism. And for the God of Israel to kill the son of the God of Egypt is to go, what kind of God is this? Which, by the way, explains why Pharaoh would all at once say, get out of here. You've killed my son. I couldn't stop you from killing my son. What kind of God is this? So a lot tied up in that. Now, again, we began by talking about the 6 different days. And again, we're not thinking scientifically here. We're thinking space versus function. We're thinking, what do the Israelites need to hear? And by the way, a very simple way of memorizing in Genesis what comes on each day. First 3 days, you create the space. You have the light, which the sun, moon, stars come into on day 4. You have the sky and the waters, which the fish and the birds come into. And then you have the dry land and the water, which then the animals and human beings come into. So notice, create space, and then he fills the space. Now, we had gotten to this. We touched on it a little bit last week, Lee, but I want us to come back and pick it up again. So, again, that phrase, subdue. What role does mankind have in the world? I mean, you think about how man is unique, above and beyond every other creature.
And by the way, you don't even have to be a believer in God to see that.
Yeah.
Even atheists acknowledge we are the supreme, in the world.
Does that mean we always make the right decisions? Of course not. Definitely not. But sometimes I think when we think of sometimes subjugate, master, bring under control, sometimes I think we sometimes think of that almost in a negative sense, and that's not what it's tended to be. Or we think of it as, well, we're supposed to subjugate. That means we can do whatever we want.
Yes, not that at all.
And sometimes, unfortunately, we've seen that. If you want, all going off topic slightly, but in marriage, you see that, the husband, well, I'm the head of the house, so I can do what I want, and I can, completely missing the whole aspect of who you are as the head of the house. I mean, you're supposed to be protecting everybody. You're not, and yes, but going back to here, subduing, putting, yes, under control to an extent, but taking care of, looking after. I say being responsible. God's given us this task of overseeing creation, and again, as we mentioned last week, we haven't done a real good job of that in a lot of circumstances. We talked about the number of animals recently, over within the last 100 years, for example, who animals that have become extinct. And mentioned, for example, the passenger pigeon. Millions of those things, and yet they're extinct and have been for quite some time. And the premise being, scientists have estimated that by the year 2100, we're going to lose approximately another 500 species of animals if we don't change the way we're doing things. So ruling is so much more than the way we think of it. Ruling is like taking care of as well, caring for, looking after.
And by the way, it's not just the animal kingdom.
Right.
It's the earth. It's creation. Some of y'all probably move your church membership after I say this, and if you do, that's fine. I can recommend some good churches around. But I was an early adapter of global warming. Jen will tell you this. And people go, why did you start believing in global warming? I tell you on one answer. It just kept getting hotter every year. And the winters were not near as cold. I remember winters when it used to get way below zero. And I would stay that way. I mean, you'd have a snow, and that snow would stay on for, a week or two. Y'all seen pictures of the Cumberland River frozen, people driving cars across it. Now, no excuse for stupidity like that, but y'all seen that, okay? Some of y'all are going, my granddaddy drove that car across. Okay, I get it. But I'm a believer that we as human beings, God has given us so much control over the world that we can actually affect climate by what we choose to throw up in the air, what we choose to do in the world, how we choose to live. And while all the science keeps showing that, and y'all listen, I don't know how many flash floods in Death Valley that causes everybody to go, what in the world just happened? And I don't know if you've seen, France is about to dry up. I mean, they're in the worst drought. There are parts of France that they say are fixing to run out of water. And by the way, if you want to see what happens when a culture built with large cities run out of water, it's not going to take long before Lake Mead is in trouble. And the next thing you know, they're going to be saying, is there any way we can divert water from the Mississippi, or any way we can pump water? I mean, they're already, by the way, I went to Israel 4 years ago. Y'all may not know this, but the Dead Sea is not only dead, it's disappearing. Rodney, I know you've been there many times. And the thing that shocked me the most when I went to the Dead Sea is that the hotels are down on the south end of it. Guess what the south end doesn't have anymore? There's no water. Do you know how they get tourists down there? They have created canals, and they pump water for the northern part of the Dead Sea into the southern part of the Dead Sea so that we Christians can go and float in it. I'm serious as a heart attack. I remember driving down through there going, what's that? And the guy, well, that's canals. The Dead Sea down here is drying up, and we don't have any water left down here, so we're pumping. We thought it was a lot easier to pump water down to the hotels than move the hotels back to where the water is, because every time you build a new hotel, guess what happens? The water line the next year disappears a little bit further. And by the way, you want to see it happening? Go to the Salt Lake Sea. Great Salt Lake Sea out in Utah. Just go out there and look. Okay? Now, again, if you want to move your membership, I get it. It's just a view I have, but it's a view I have because I believe that we are responsible for creation. I believe that we are. Christians should be the most, what's the word I'm looking for? Not tree huggers. I don't want to worship nature.
No, but
I want to
we should
fulfill
have,
God's command.
I mean, we should be the most caring
yes,
of
there
what
you
God
go.
has given us.
And so This something, I love the fact that we brought deer back. June and I had to stop for turkeys yesterday. I mean, we're driving down Neely's Bend, and a whole bunch of turkeys are crossing the road. How many of y'all remember when there were no turkeys? Y'all remember that? I grew up in Mississippi. Only turkey there was around us was my little brother. I mean, that was it. There were no turkeys. Now we got turkeys. We as human beings have been trying to say, can we help nature come back? And in some areas, we're doing a great job. We were down Neely's Bend just recently and saw some friends down there, and they said, you know what we saw on Neely's Bend the other day? And I said, no, what? Said a bobcat jumped across the road in front of us. I mean, I grew up as a kid, there weren't any bobcats around. Now you see bobcats. So nature's coming back, and again, a lot of human beings trying to do a lot to do that. All right, take this one, because this is fun. I'm going to let you have the challenge taker for a couple of them.
So God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, so they will be yours for food. So, God's telling us we've got food. And He provides it for mankind. Let's see, move along.
Yeah, I gave it to you too fast.
You gave it to me too quick.
I gave it. Let me have it back.
You have
it
back,
right back.
and then
okay.
you give it back.
God gives us food, which, by the way, is in line with everything else God's given Israel. God gave Israel time, day one, morning and evening, or evening and morning. Water above, water below on day two. Land, a place to eat, a place to live, or where you can grow food. Coming out of Egypt, dry land was very important around the Nile. It gave them lights, lamps to govern the day, the weeks, the years, the holy days, and of course that's the sun, moon, and stars. He gave us fish and birds in order to populate the earth, animals, including those that are domestic, one of the important things, and then of course us in God's image.
Okay.
Now I'll
you
hand
got
it back.
Okay, so all the beasts of the earth, all the birds in the sky, all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food, and it was so. So there's, Genesis 1:30 is telling us this very, just making this statement. Now, a question that arises, initially then, did every creature eat only plants? Have to stop and think, well, I don't know, because if we stop and think, what was anything dying during this time? If nothing was dying, then clearly everything had to be eating something other than other animals, and yet we also know that animals, just naturally,
Lions don't tend to eat anything except things that run.
Yeah. Which is why whenever I see a lion, I just stand still.
That's right.
So, or I run with you because I can outrun you.
You can.
And that's
no
all,
doubt about it.
That's all that matters.
Yep.
As long as you can outrun the slowest person, you're good.
But this is one of the questions we ask.
Right.
And again, I'm afraid that we're asking the wrong question. I think this is a statement more about the harmony of creation instead of the nature of creation. And the reason I say that is the next verse. If you'll throw up the next one. This is from Isaiah 11. This is the future kingdom. This is the new heavens and the new earth. And the cow will feed with the bear, and their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. And so you look at that text, and is this a statement of reality, or is this a statement of the contrast between peace and violence in creation? And I think those are questions you've got to ask yourself. What was, again, Moses trying to answer? Because, again, you look at the animal kingdom and you're like, aren't some animals reliant on other animals just to survive? Because we all know that whether it's fish or whether it's birds, you've got the certain types of birds that don't eat plants. They eat other animals. The bald eagle. Bald eagle doesn't land in your yard and get food out of your bird feeder, right? It's going to go down into, Old Hickory Lake and grab a fish out. And so you got to step back and ask yourself, again, is this a scientific issue that's going on in Genesis, or is this a theological issue? And again, if you say, but Les, you're not answering the scientific question. If it's not to be answered, I don't answer it. I mean, if that's not the reason for it. You know, it's kind of like when someone comes up to me, Lee, in a couple of chapters, we'll get down to it, where did Cain get his wife? I don't have a clue. Well, she had to come from somewhere. I get it. But I don't know where she came from. People say, well, it had to be a sister. Okay, if you want to believe that, go for it. Yeah. You know, I just don't know that that's the answer to the question. The text doesn't tell us. And so, some issues. We're going to see some more here in just a moment. So
well,
let's move.
And just saying real quick, going back to, you know, this whole aspect, well, you know, did animals eat it? You know, what? I used to always think years ago, you know, for a long time, is like, well, when Cain killed Abel, not only did he kill the first, you know, commit the first murder, he caused an animal to be killed.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, God had to kill the animal to give, you know. So, yes, God made, you know, he did make things for them, and obviously an animal would have given its life for that. But was that the first animal? Well, that's a whole nother ball game.
Again, if you're not careful, you're asking questions in the text. And boy, Leah and I can sit here and just ask question after question after question. You know, and of course you're sitting there going, okay, does the text answer it? No. Why? Because the text was never intended to answer that question. Again, you got to look, what are the questions the text is answering?
Yeah. Again, and God saw all that he made, and it was not just good, it was very good.
Yeah.
You know, just not just good, useful, had purpose. I mean, and you stop and think, you know, the sixth day, and I can only begin to try to imagine after God has done this and looking and seeing that and just recognizing just how good everything was and what the world was supposed to be like, you know, until sin came and messed it up, you know, or we messed it up by committing sin. But thinking about how wonderful everything was, how everything that God had made, he made it with a purpose. There was a reason for it. It worked together. And yet then in just a short while, just about all of it gets destroyed again.
Yeah, goes into chaos. It started in chaos, verse 2, you know, spirits hovering above the waters, and then it returns to chaos in the flood. And then, of course, out of that comes a new order. Absolutely. Yeah. But very good. You know, God creates a good world. A lot of worlds in the ancient world, a lot of the creation narratives coming out of Egypt, coming out of Babylon, were not good creation narratives. Babylonian narrative, for instance, we are created to serve the gods. We are slaves to the gods. And by the way, in the Babylonian narrative, or maybe the Egyptian flood narrative, I had to go back and read on that. But one of the reasons the flood was brought is because we human beings were too loud. We were making too much noise for the gods. They couldn't do what they needed to do, and so they're like, we got to shut them up. And so that's why the flood came. Again, very different worldview.
I'm really glad that God promised never to destroy the world by a flood again. When I start, particularly when you're talking about how much noise, and I think about the number of times somebody's pulled up beside me, and they've got their, you know, just really loud in the stereo. I was like, well, that would have been a good reason for destruction again.
June would agree 100% with you, especially if they're not in a car, if they're living next door to us. June's the only person I know of when they're having a good time next door and the music is boom, 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 that June says to me, go over there and stop it. I go, what do you mean? Why do I need to go over there and stop it? And so I have, on occasion, gone over and said, would you please turn that thing down before my wife divorces me? And so, but yeah. So let's move to the last one.
Yeah.
So the heavens and the earth were completed. This is a sandwich. Let's punch it one more time there, Lee, because it goes back to Genesis 1:1. So you have this sandwich that takes place. And now God's going to move a different direction.
Yeah. You know, and so we, you know, stop and think about what comes to mind when we hear the word rest. You know, what really comes to mind? You know, in our way of thinking, a lot of times, or at least the way I think, you know, if I'm going to take a rest, I'm going to go and stretch out. I'm going to lie down, maybe take a nap, whatever. But rest can have a very different meaning than that. And we see that, in Joshua chapter 21. The Lord gave them, as he's given Canaan into Israel's hands. He says he's given them rest on every side, just to see it sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. This idea of rest wasn't that Israel was just, we can just sit back and relax. Everything's good. We don't have to do anything. No. What they did have was they had rest from their enemies so that they could begin to do the works that they were created to do, take care of, to start to tend the land and expand and so forth, so on. But again, we've got to think about what rest actually entails and what it falls into.
Yeah, and this resting by God is one of the things that we, especially in churches of Christ, we need to come back and visit this one. I was raised where if somebody asked the question, do y'all practice the Ten Commandments? And my standard response is all but one of them. And they say, which one is that? And I'd say, honor your father. No, I didn't say that. Keep the Sabbath day. And the older I get, the more I realize that we really have misunderstood, first of all, what Sabbath is, and secondly, why it's so important that we have it. The Lord blessed the Sabbath day, made it holy. Holy means simply set it apart, because on it he rested. And Lee, you're exactly right. It's not that God was tired.
Yeah. God
doesn't get tired. Something else is going on. God is not doing anything, and it's not that that's not correct. God's not doing work. Let's rephrase that. God's not doing work. Rested from all the work. Notice the language there. Now, rest plays this incredible role. You go back to Exodus. This is the first time the word Sabbath shows up. And by the way, the word Sabbath is the word for rest. Sabbath is not seventh. Sabbath is the seventh day, but seventh and Sabbath are not the same word. Sabbath just is a number. Sabbath means rest. He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest. Notice that. Sabbath rest. A holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake, boil what you want to boil, save whatever is left, and keep it until morning. This is when God's preparing for them. And Lee, they had already, some of them had tried to take the manna and get as much as you could. Boy, they're like, we don't need to trust the Lord to give it to us. We'll get enough that we can save it for several days. And what was the end result?
Yeah, it just molded. If they were, let's just say it was Tuesday, well, we're going to, hoard it and get it all together. Well, Wednesday they get up and it's
molded, maggots.
Molded, maggots.
Ruined.
I mean, you can't use it.
Yeah.
And of course, then you have the other issue where he's saying, okay, seventh day rest. Make sure you've got what you need on, Friday, because Saturday it's not going to be there. And of course, some of them go out to gather it, and it's not there.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I kind of think about, God is almost as a parent, and I stop and think about as a parent to our kids at times, like, did you not listen to what I said? Did you not, hear what I told you if you did this is what was going to happen. Well, God's the same way. I told you, don't, you got to make sure you get enough for the Sabbath day. Get it the night before, day before, but you're not listening. You got to trust me.
Now, why is Sabbath so important? We don't appreciate this because we grew up in a world where we had weekends off. Let's face it, our work schedule was 5 days, some worked 6 days, but for the most of us, Saturdays, Sundays, that's the time to rest, to do yard work, whatever. Imagine a world where you worked sunrise to sunset 7 days a week. 7 days a week. I want you to imagine that. And I'm not talking about easy work. I'm talking about hard work. That was the life of the Israelites. They were slaves. Pharaoh didn't say, guess what? You've worked 40 hours, you can take the rest of the week off. It's not the way life worked. So here are people who are, all of their lives, all they've done is work every day, all day long. Kind of reminds me of my dad growing up on a farm in Mississippi. I asked my dad one time, I said, Dad, what did you do after you worked plowed the fields. What did you do for fun? And he said, we went to bed and slept. He said, son, you don't understand. We got up in the morning at 5 o'clock. We were in the field plowing by 6:30. We worked all day. When we got home, we milked the cows. We took care of this. We took care of that. We washed our feet. We went to bed and did it all over again.
Yeah, see, I'd go to as a kid, I'd go down to my mom's side. Her parents, my grandparents, that side, had a farm.
Yeah.
You go down there for a week. It was fun. It was fun for a week to go and, help with things and stuff. And, oh, this is great. And believe me, by the time it was evening, you were ready to go to bed. But, it was fun for a week. It was different, but I'd start, if I thought back on it now, I was like, I don't think I'd want to do that all the time.
My dad used to say this. He said, people talk about the good old days. He said, I didn't know any good old days. As soon as my dad graduated high school, he's like, man, there's a factory hiring, and there was a factory named Genesco hiring, and my dad said, I think I'll go make shoes. At least I get off Saturday and Sundays. Very different worldview, and that's why it was so important. And so here's God trying to teach Israelites who know no concept of rest, none, why rest is important, and they're not buying into it. Like you said, some are trying to get too much, some are going out the next day because they didn't get enough. And so God enshrined it in the law. In the 10 Commandments, God said you've got to rest. And it's not just they've got to rest. I think you've got this one here.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at that text, boy, it expands in so many directions.
Yeah. No one was to work on the Sabbath. Not just the adults, but children, animals weren't supposed to be doing anything.
No plowing on the Sabbath day.
No plowing on the Sabbath day. If you had foreigners who were dwelling in the land, they had to take that same, they had to follow the rule too. It basically just covered everything at that point. Now, what did God's law constitute as work versus what the oral law and tradition has tended to constitute as work? And that is a whole nother issue as far as, and some of the things that the people would try to get around certain things as well. When we stop and think about, they weren't supposed to walk, a Sabbath day's journey was as far as you could walk on the Sabbath day, which was, what was that?
You'll have to ask Rodney that question. That's not too far, right?
Yeah.
Not too far.
It wasn't, it was, I would say it was less than, I don't know if it was like half a mile or something, but it wouldn't have been much further than that. Some of the folks, in order to be able to go further, well, they would take some of the items from their house. When they got to that certain point, they'd take that item, stick it there, so, well, this is still my house, so I can go another bit of distance, and so forth, so on. They'd find their ways around it. But, what God constituted as work versus what the oral law traditions constituted as work, it went back, kind of looked to the chosen last week.
Yeah, that was one of the issues. And of course, the problem became by the time Jesus got here is that, and Jesus laid it out simple. He says, listen, the Sabbath was made for you. You weren't made for the Sabbath. If we're not careful, we get it turned around the opposite direction. The Sabbath was supposed to be a blessing. It had become a curse.
Yeah.
And so.
And what exceptions would need to be in place with regards to not working? I mean, there had to be exceptions. I mean, if there weren't exceptions, let's face it, and the enemies of God
would have a heyday.
Would have a heyday on the Sabbath day.
Yep.
Because they're just like, well, the soldier, no, we can't do anything.
Which is, by the way, when Israel was attacked, even back in the which war, Rodney? Was it 68 or 72 was the Yom Kippur War? Which war was the Yom Kippur War back in the 60s and 70s? Like 72, yeah. But one of them was the Yom Kippur War, which Yom Kippur is the holiest day for the Jews, and the Arabs decided this is when we attack. We get them when they're not ready. And boy, Israel had to learn, okay, we've got to find a way to deal with this issue. And that's true in modern day Israel. It was true in ancient Israel as well.
Yeah. So I mean, there were exceptions. You know, it just God expects us to use common sense.
Your oxen falling in
Yeah.
a ditch, Jesus said. Your ox falling in the ditch, do you get him out on the Sabbath? Yes. I've never, by the way, gotten an oxen out of a ditch, but I bet it's hard work. Just,
Yeah.
Just guessing.
Yeah, I would much rather just get a little puppy out of a ditch.
Yes,
That'd
absolutely.
be much simpler. But yeah. So there would be these, and basically He expects us to use common sense as well. And unfortunately, what would sometimes happen, particularly when you got into the strict side of, was that Shamash? What was there was Hillel and there was
Shammai.
Shammai. You know, if you had his
Yeah.
side of view of things, you became so strict about stuff. You know, again, you were instead of looking for ways to help the people, you were looking for ways almost to destroy the people.
Yeah.
And that was, again, completely against what God had in mind. And we just lose, we lose focus. But this whole idea, of we don't keep the Sabbath but boy, it sure is important to rest.
Yeah, watch the text here. This is an important text. You need to look at it. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath. Who? The Israelites. Sabbath existed before Moses. The seventh day existed before Moses. But Abraham didn't observe the Sabbath. Isaac didn't observe the Sabbath. Jacob didn't observe the Sabbath. The Sabbath is now given to Israel as a people. So notice, the Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It'll be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. On the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Now, watch what happens when you get to the New Testament and we Gentiles come in. So, the question, should Lee, as a good Gentile, keep the Sabbath? So, let's look what the early church said.
And of course, this is where we run, where you had the big conference. Some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. This, a little bit of, prior to this, Paul and Barnabas had, they'd been, preaching, and they'd already run into this issue. The Pharisees were saying, hey, this is what's required. There was obviously a lot of conflict involved. And they said, okay, let's go up to Jerusalem and get this sorted out. And so that's where they come to, and this is a situation.
And again, these are Pharisee Christians, or Christian Pharisees, however you want to say that. But their view is Gentiles have to be circumcised, they have to keep the dietary laws, they have to keep the Sabbath. All of this has got to be upon the Gentiles if they're going to be Christians. And so they go, and Peter gets up, and I love Peter's comment here. He says, now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke that we couldn't even keep? 613 laws.
Yeah.
And the Jews are like, Peter's like, are you kidding me? We're going to try to bind this on the Gentiles? And so they decide, no, this is not going to take place. And I believe, as our next text, the Colossians text, yeah. Paul will say to the Colossians, therefore, don't let people judge you. Don't let people condemn you because of what you eat or drink. In other words, kosher food, non-kosher food. In other words, if you eat catfish, eat catfish. Jews couldn't eat it, but if you want to, you eat it. Or religious festivals, Passover, Pentecost, tabernacles. Gentiles, don't let them judge you on it. And then notice, new moon festivals and Sabbath days. But let's do pause and ask this question.
Yeah.
And is it an actual question? Yes.
Yes.
So, do we observe the Sabbath? I think we've got to step back, because what ended up for a lot of us as Christians is in jettisoning the law of Moses, we jettisoned a principle that God didn't mean to be jettisoned. Rest is important. God rested. He wants us to rest. And you said a while ago, it's not taking a nap.
Right.
I think it's making space for God.
Reflection.
It's reflection. It's time to meditate. It's time to realize that there is something bigger going on than the work that we do 6 days a week. And that which is going on, of course, is God. And so if you turn over to Galatians, Paul says, listen, the Old Testament had a purpose, and it was to keep us in custody, lock us up until faith comes. And so verse 24 says, so the law was our guardian until Christ came. Now, while we're not bound by the law, at the same time, we need to realize the value of what God was trying to teach us. Your parents put any restrictions on you as far as how late you could stay out at night when you were a teenager?
They were actually more, for lack of a better term, liberal on that than probably a lot of parents were. But I typically I had to be, by the time I was, by the time I could drive and all, I had to typically if it was school night, you had to be in, no later than. It was usually like 9 o'clock or something. I had to be in no later than that. If I was not a school night, I could be out, maybe till 11 or 12, something like that. But they would be okay if I was out later, as long as I was always checked with them well ahead in advance. Hey, you got to check in. If you're going to stay out, or if you want to stay out, you check in. We'll let you know whether you can do that or not. But there were certainly restrictions involved as far, and again, it was for their own, it was for our own good,
What's the old saying? Nothing good happens after midnight, right? And boy, there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah, I was 11 o'clock until I got, to be a senior. At senior, it moved to 12 o'clock. But let me tell you something. Last thing in the world you want to do. And by the way, one night I was going to be out later than 12 o'clock. One of my friends was going to call his mother. His mother was going to call all the other mothers. Guess whose mother didn't get called? I show up at about 1 o'clock, and my dad's in the living room, and my mom is gone. She's driving around the countryside looking for her son. And when I walked in and saw my dad, I'm like, I am in major trouble. Now, what's funny about that, Lee, is that happened when I was, I don't know, maybe 17 years old. When I went to Freed, Mom and Dad never called once to find out if I was in the dorm on time. They didn't care anymore. I'm like, do y'all not care anymore? No, that's not it. They expect us to grow up.
Yeah.
You're on your own. And by the way, that can be incredibly discomforting for those of us who are parents when we let our kids go, right? By the way, another one you want me to give you an example of? You remember the first time you let your son or daughter drive the car without you in it? I went to get my oldest son. I went with him to get his driver's license. He almost wrecked going to the station. I mean, we get to a red light on due west, and I go, watch out for that car! He slams on his brake. Dad, don't scare me like that. And I said, scare you? And so I'm sitting there thinking, and I told June this, as we're going to the driver's license station, I said, there is no way a state trooper is going to let him get a driver's license. I waited out in the car. He came out. He held it up, and I said, God save all of us. I had to turn him over. I had to turn him loose, right? God turns us loose. Doesn't mean like we can stay out all night anymore. I don't stay out. God at some point says, can you just grow up and understand why it's important to get rest? And so, should we rest? Yes. Do we have to, keep...
Do we have to do it at a particular time?
Legalistically, do we have to, do it legalistically? No. So when people say to me, do y'all believe that you need to have Sabbath in churches of Christ? I say, I don't know about everybody in churches of Christ. I do. I have to have Sabbath. I don't legalistically do it. I don't do it from sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. So now we're going to start in chapter 2, and we're not going to wait into the next text because it gets... Let me introduce it to you as a preview for next week. Well, you get the genealogies. We've already talked about the genealogies in lesson 1. You get all these generations, which kind of break the book up. And so we're now with the generations of the heavens and the earth. And then you get with this statement. We're going to tease you with this one. Now, no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground, and then God makes man. What's wrong with that picture? When did God create the plants? Day 3, right? Why now do we have God creating man and God saying no plant, no shrub had yet appeared? And with that, you can lead us in a closing prayer.
Let's pray. God, we do thank you for this day, and we thank you for your blessings. We thank you that you continue to care for us each and every day. We recognize that we have trials and tribulations, and yet we also know that you are there for us in all things. You never leave us alone. You are there to help us, to strengthen us, to provide answers for us. We pray that you will continue to use us as a light to our families, to our neighbors, to our friends, to those we work with, to those who at times maybe even be enemies, and yet we still can and need to try to be the influence that you would have us to be. We think of those, we all have various people that we know that are dealing with various struggles. We ask a blessing on them. We certainly pray for those who've been devastated so much with the floods in recent days and weeks, as well as the droughts and the fires in other places. We pray that you will help us to do what we can as people to try to alleviate these situations, to try to certainly help those who are in need, but also to try to make decisions, and that our countries make decisions that will help our nature, help the nature that you created, help it to recover from the circumstances that it's in. We certainly continue to pray for those who are dealing with war, particularly in Ukraine area, and we pray for that peace can come about there just as soon as possible. Again, we ask for your guidance. We always thank you